Ah, the story of Dead by Daylight. A tale as old as time. Or something. This is the backstory, lore, whatever you want to call it, of every single killer in the game to date. The killers are listed in the order that they were released, so feel free to hop around the chapters that I so tediously added and listen to your favorite ones. It has been my pleasure putting this video together over the past 5 months, and I hope you guys enjoy. Anywho, onward! This is the story of the Trapper, Evan McMillan. So he was a bit of a father's boy. His father was not a very good human being, which you will soon find out. His mother, on the other hand, he was very fond of, but she unfortunately died in a mysterious swimming accident. His father claimed that she was pulled in by the current, but more on that soon. Evan was the heir to a great fortune. His father, Archie McMillan, was owner of one of the most profitable mines in Seattle. His father was a horrible boss. He would constantly shit on the workers and treat them horribly, and he called them maggots. He would always preach to Evan to break the workers. He said that was the key, and the key is to break them. He said once broken, a human is a tool that can be wielded to do anything. And this was just Archie's way of getting people to do the things that he wanted them to do. He would assault people in any way possible. Evan even being on the receiving end of that as a child. One time his dad broke Evan's jaw after claiming that Evan was showing weakness. But Evan had a good heart, man. He didn't like the treatment that the workers were getting from his father, and he knew it was wrong, but at the same time, he was extremely loyal to his father, and he would do anything that he asked of him. Like the time when his dad forced him to set up a bear trap in a dark forest. His father was obsessed with hunting bears, and on these trips with Evan, he would always tell him about the story where he was out hunting bears with his brother, and a bear snuck up on them and attacked his brother and ripped his arm off and his head. But the specific details of the story would always change, and Evan didn't really believe his father. He didn't believe that a bear attacked his uncle. He had the nagging suspicion that his father killed his uncle. He believed this because his uncle was a philanthropist, and Archie was scared his brother would run the business into the ground with proper wages and socialist crap. So yeah, a bit sketchy. Also, speaking of sketchy, Evan liked to sketch. He liked creating art, but he would have to hide it from his father because his father said it was for weaklings, vagabonds, gypsies. But scarred from the thought of his father murdering Evan's uncle, he would sketch his father in a bear suit murdering his brother. Evan would also sadly make sketches of his father in a bear suit once again, drowning his mother because they didn't believe that she would just go for a swim and get pulled away by the current. And at this point, Archie McMillan's mental health was deteriorating rapidly. It would finally reach a breaking point when Archie commanded Evan to commit one of the worst mass murders in modern history. But to get there, we gotta backtrack a little bit. I mentioned that Evan had a soft spot for some of the workers. Some of them were his friends, and he learned from them that a union was coming because word got out about the incredibly harsh conditions at the mine. Evan wasn't sure who to be loyal to, so he just kind of kept it a secret from his father. That would be until one of the workers ratted Evan out for knowing about the union. Evan came home one day to find the sketch that he drew of his uncle getting murdered ripped up into pieces, and he noticed the sketch of his mother being drowned was missing completely. So when he went to confront his father about it, he found that his father had framed the picture that Evan drew of his mother and put it above his bed. Archie explained that he knew everything. He told Evan about the worker ratting him out about the union. He told Evan that tomorrow he will learn a lesson, one he hopes he understands. I'm assuming the lesson was fuck around and find out, because the next day, Archie would command Evan to lead over 100 men into dark tunnels that were filled with explosives. And like I said, Evan did anything his dad asked of him. He was also filled with hatred for the worker that had ratted him out. After the massacre, there would be no records of Evan McMillan. Archie McMillan was found trapped in the locked basement of his own warehouse, starved and abandoned. This is the story of the Hillbilly. Behavior's least favorite killer, the Hillbilly, was released alongside the original killer trio on June 14th, 2016. This poor fellow has received the short end of the stick in every way possible, from his character design to his lore, and even to this day receiving nerf after nerf. Obviously, the Wish version of Bubba, aka Leatherface, Max Thompson Jr. is a horribly disfigured, hillbilly, who wields a chainsaw and a hammer and flies through the map at Mach 10 speeds, which which totally makes sense as most people use chainsaws as a means for transportation. However, this insane chainsaw mobility is the one redeeming factor for Billy and sets him apart from what Bubba can do with his chainsaw. Max Thompson Jr. is not the name his parents gave him, by the way. They just called him Boy. You'll learn why in just a second. The Hillbilly's parents, Max Thompson Sr. and Evelyn Thompson, were wealthy landowners who ran the Coldwind Farm. They were completely ashamed of Billy due to him being born hideously disfigured. Not wanting anyone to witness the horrible creature that their questionably combined genetics created, Junior's parents bricked him off in a section of their house and fed him through a hole in the wall. Fortunately, he would escape one day and exact revenge on the people who created him by slaughtering his parents. Now on his own, the newly self-titled Max Thompson Jr. had an entire farm to himself. He spent the rest of his days the same way any horribly abused and deranged hillbilly would, by torturing any animal he could find on the farm. Coldwind Farm would eventually be split up and sold off. Max and Evelyn Thompson's bodies were never found. No one would ever purchase the farmhouse, however, perhaps it was the sound of the chainsaw you could hear throughout those hot summer nights. This is the story of the Wraith. On June 14th, 2006, the original killer trio would be released with the launch of Dead by Daylight. The Trapper, the Hillbilly, and our boy, the Wraith, would be released into the fog ready to hunt down locker camping Dwights and tree crouching, urban evasion rocking Meg Thomases. But we're not here to make solo cue puns and waste time. Nope, we're here to talk about the Wraith, aka Philip Ojimo. Philip Ojimo had fled his homeland of Nigeria after witnessing nothing but death everywhere he turned. He came to America for a new beginning. Little did he know, death always had a close eye on him. With a lot of persistence and a little bit of luck, he landed a job in a small scrapyard called Auto Haven Wreckers. There, he would fix cars and handle the crusher, and he was very good at his job. The business at Auto Haven was shady, to say the least, but we'll get to that. One day, Philip was hard at work, just crushing all the cars, when he noticed some blood coming from one of the soon-to-be crushed cars. In the trunk, Philip would find a young man who was gagged and tied up. He quickly untied the young man, who then wasted no time in getting the fuck out of Dodge. He would unfortunately make it no more than 10 feet before Philip's boss appeared out of nowhere and slit the man's throat. Philip, very confused, demanded answers. His boss would then spill the beans that Auto Haven Wreckers were into some very unprofessional business. Philip learned he was the oblivious executioner crushing more than just cars. In the vast majority of the cars he crushed, a person would be trapped inside. The scrapyard were providing a service to certain undisclosed clients. Philip absolutely lost it. In a satisfying act of justice, he grabbed his boss and threw him into the crusher. With his boss's body now trapped and head sticking out, Philip grabbed him by his head and ripped it and his spine clean out of the body. Philip dipped and was never seen again. This is the story of the nurse. So today we've got the nurse, aka Sally Smithson. Sally was happily married to her husband, Andrew, who was a lumberjack. And Sally had dreams of having the American dream. Kids and then a nice home that was built by Andrew. That would unfortunately not be the case. But before I get to that, some little insight. Logging and, being a lumberjack is actually one of the most dangerous jobs in the world, according to OSHA. It's actually number 2 in the world, right after apparently fishing and hunting workers, which I don't quite understand what that means, but being a lumberjack is not as pretty as it seems. So, one day, Sally gets the unfortunate news that her husband did not make it after a lumberjacking accident, and obviously Sally is devastated. She lost the love of her life. So now Sally's all on her own, and she's got to figure out a way to put food on the table. So she decides to take up a job at Crotus Pren Asylum. Working at Crotus Pren is kind of like, working at McDonald's. You kind of only do it if you absolutely need to. But for some reason she sticks it out there for 20 years, which is pretty mind-boggling. Oh, and I should mention she picked up a night shift there. To make matters even worse, she has to work the night shift at an insane asylum. And so obviously over the course of 20 years, this is going to make a huge impact on someone's own sanity. Being around constant insanity all the time is not going to have a good effect. And so the job starts wearing down on her, and obviously she probably never really recovered from losing Andrew. Her mental stability starts dwindling for sure. She's constantly getting harassed and berated by the patients there because they're insane and they have no limits, you know? So she finally reaches her breaking point, and one day in September, some staff would find over 50 patients and 4 other staff members that were dead from an apparent strangle. The police show up. Sally is obviously the sole survivor, and she's just there sitting in a corner rocking back and forth, and obviously at this point her mind is completely gone. So the police take her and put her in an ambulance to take her to a hospital and maybe get some help for her, I don't know. But the ambulance would never make it there. It would be found crashed in some trees in a forest, and everyone in the ambulance was dead, but of course Sally was missing. She would never be found after that point, and this is because she is now a killer for the entity.
Known for his colossal role in 13 movies from the horror series Halloween, Michael Myers is a seriously bad apple who receives great joy from inflicting pain on others. He did not have any qualms about hurting others. In fact, it was something that gave him immense pleasure. But despite his twisted mind, even he had to deal with the struggles of life. However, Michael dealt with his issues in a particularly gruesome way. Killing was his twisted way of finding inner peace. He even murdered his own sister as a boy, and when the authorities found him at the scene, he was dressed as a clown, silent and emotionless. Intent on providing him with the help he needed, officials sent him to a mental institution, hoping to cure him of his violent tendencies. Unfortunately, the therapy and screams he endured there only made him more deranged and introverted. The public's hope was that Michael Myers would eventually fade away and people would forget about him. But fate had other plans in store. When Mikey managed to escape from the institution, the world realized that he was far from gone. His reign of terror continued, and his legend will forever live on thanks to the guiding hand of the entity.
This is the story of the Hag. The quaint village Lisa grew up in was a place just outside the edges of civilization. It was a peaceful place full of kind people and elders full of wisdom. The wholesome vibe of the village could only be attributed to the charms that the elders would teach the children to draw on the ground for safety and good fortune. It had kept them safe and sound for generations. One night, Lisa was heading back to the village after venturing off into the woods to do some exploring. Out of nowhere, a very powerful storm blew in. The wind whipped around and rain poured down. In the midst of this very strong storm, Lisa managed to lose her footing in the mud, falling backwards and cracking her noggin on a rock. As she slowly slipped in and out of consciousness, she noticed dark shapes appear from the woods, heading her way. When she awoke, she found herself chained to the wall of a flooded cellar. She looked around the room and found she was not alone. Also chained to the wall were other people with horrible wounds, some exposed down to the bone. Flies were everywhere, feasting on the rot. Poor Lisa would quickly come to realize that she and her new dying friends were the unfortunate upcoming meal for a group of cannibals. For weeks, Lisa would be mutilated, starved, and overwhelmed with infection. So much of her arm had deteriorated that with a little bit of elbow grease, sorry, bit of a tasteless pun, she was able to pull her arm free from her chains. Unfortunately, the damage to her body was too severe, and she knew she would not make it much longer. With her last breath drawing near, she thought of home. She thought of the elders. She fell to the floor, and using what remained of her fingers, she etched the symbols the elders taught her into the floor. Almost immediately, she was overcome with a sense of a very dark hunger. She craved nothing more than blood and vengeance. Lisa's village sent out a search party to find her and the missing people. Their efforts eventually brought them to an old shack in a swamp. Inside, the search party would find whoever was previously occupying the place had been completely torn apart by an unidentifiable animal. In the cellar, among the piles of rotting corpses, they would find their elders' charms scrawled into the floor, written in blood. Lisa's body was never found, and the village was never the same again. This is the story of the Doctor. Herman Carter showed an interest in the human psyche from an early age. To deconstruct something as complex as the brain intrigued him greatly. Herman was a very smart cookie, and he excelled in high school. He was even published in Partisan, which was a psychology newspaper. Thanks to his educational prowess, he was fast-tracked into Yale's Advanced Neuroscience program, which was actually a front for the CIA. Carter and other top-tier recruits were then transferred to a secret black site facility in Illinois known as Larry's Memorial Institute. The whole goal of the Institute was to extract information from prisoners that were sent there. Here, Carter would meet a fellow by the name of Dr. Otto Stamper, and Stamper would then become Carter's mentor at the facility. Carter was encouraged by Stamper to use any means necessary to explore methods of extracting information, and he told him to not consider the facility a normal medical facility. Carter was unsupervised, there were no rules, and he was just left to his own means. So Carter took this freedom and began working on a project. The project was called Project Awakening, and he described it as experimental interrogation. He was using what he called electroshock therapy to get the information they wanted from these prisoners. The project was approved, and no one knocked on Carter's door. Over time, the facility became a place of horrific and bizarre torture. There was screaming and moaning just filling the corridor outside his lab, but as long as the enemy was kept at bay, no one batted an eye. And over the years, Carter became known as the Doctor. Prisoners would beg to be taken to any other lab besides the doctor's, and no one ever really gave a shit what Carter did. No one ever questioned if he had a medical degree or what happened to the prisoners once the information was extracted. That would be until Larry's went silent for a week. Patients and prisoners were found dead or in vegetative states with all types of head trauma. Dr. Stamper was found with his head peeled open and electrodes and sensors inserted into his still living brain. Herman the Dr. Carter was not found, but his research paper suggests that he had been using prisoners as part of awful electroshock therapy experiments to search for the panacea of mind control. The government didn't want to know. The black site was condemned and all knowledge of the Larry's Memorial Institute redacted forever. This is the story of the Huntress. Anna, better known as the Huntress, was an outdoorsy kid who spent her youth learning how to survive the harsh climate of the northern woods, following the guidance of her loving mother. When they ran out of sunlight, they would seek refuge in their sturdy old cabin where Anna would rest in her mother's arms, playing with wooden toys and masks her mother made for her. Mama Huntress would put Anna to sleep with stories and lullabies. Everything was cool and kosher in the woods. In the midst of a brutal winter, the Huntress were out in the woods stalking a great elk. Food rations were running low, and even though this was an absolute unit of a deer, they knew they needed this kill. Without warning, the elk spotted Anna and started hauling ass straight for her, like Bubba spotting a baby Dwight going into the basement. Anna was paralyzed with fear, only able to watch in awe as the beast got closer and closer. At the last second possible, Anna's mother threw herself in front of the elk, axe in hand. The elk impaled Mama Huntress on its antlers and lifted her into the air. Mama Huntress summoned as much power as she could and threw her axe down on the elk's noggin again and again. Eventually, its antlers snapped and Mama Huntress and the elk collapsed. As Mama Huntress and the elk slowly began to die, all Anna could do to comfort her mother was to hum her favorite lullaby. Now that she was on her own, Anna could do only what she knew how to do: survive. She followed her instincts and became one with the wild. She grew older and stronger, becoming a dangerous predator and no longer a human. Anna would hunt everything that came into her path. Wolves, bears, didn't matter. And when some travelers accidentally made their way through her woods, she found her new favorite prey: humans. She would slaughter them like any other animal, but she couldn't bring herself to kill the little girls. She desperately craved the closest of a loved one, so she would keep the little girls and raise them as her own. And by raise them, I mean she would tie them around the neck so they couldn't wander off outside, as they would surely die because of their lack of survival skills. But she was unfit to raise a child, shocking I know, and they would die of cold, starvation, or sickness. Each child lost plunged Anna deeper into sorrow and madness. Anna began raiding villages in the Red Forest, seeking out families to steal more daughters from, but the hunt would never end. War eventually came to the forest. German soldiers began to pass through on their way to throw down with the Russian Empire. There were no more travelers in the Red Forest, only soldiers. And once the war had disappeared, so had the life of the Red Forest, and along with it, the rumors of the Huntress. This is the story of Bubba summarized in 1 minute. Let's get it, dude. Bubba is a loving, caring family man who will do anything to protect them. His love for them is so strong that he kills because he's scared that his family will be disappointed in him for letting their secret get out. Their secret is they eat people. They have an issue with kids that are constantly snooping around their property. They usually catch and eat these kids, but one of them is an absolute juicer and manages to get away. The kid gets help from a trucker who spotted them in the road. And get this, the trucker ends up running over Bubba's brother. I reckon that's a bit stronger than a pallet stun. Bubba leapt at the trucker, but this Chad trucker was apparently a god and pulled an Uno reversal on him, turning Bubba's own saw against him. The trucker and kid get away, and Bubba is terrified what will happen to his family when the Popos show up. He becomes possessed by a feeling of something much bigger than his fear of what the outsiders would do, something bigger that lived in the shadows. He is now fully entranced by the entity, and his only focus is to stop the threat of the outsiders, aka the survivors. Oh my god, so crazy. This is the story of The Nightmare. Based off the 2010 remake of A Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy was a janitor at a preschool named Badham in the fictitious town of Springwood, Ohio. Of course it's Ohio. Freddy was accused of doing some very bad things to the children at the preschool. However, he managed to evade incarceration through a loophole in the justice system. The parents of the abused children were rightfully enraged, so they took the law into their own hands and hunted down Freddy, trapping him in the broiler room of the very same place he took his victims. They doused the place in gasoline and set it ablaze. Freddy's body died, but his spirit would live on. Fueled by the terror of his victims, Freddy would make a comeback via their dreams and kill them while dreaming, which also killed them IRL. Making his way down the list of the former children at the preschool, Freddy killed all of them, and only 2 remained. He set his sights on killing his favorite victim and main obsession, Nancy Holbrook. However, Nancy would have the assistant of her friend and fellow preschool classmate, Quentin Smith. Fun fact, Nancy Holbrook, or Nancy Thompson in the original film, was intended to be released as a survivor in DVD. However, the developers couldn't obtain the rights of actress Rooney Mara, who played her in the remake. So instead, we just got Quentin. Anywho, the trio went at it, and Nancy manages to best Freddy, leaving him for dead once more. But, just like taxes every year, Freddy would come back once more. He now turned his attention on the kid stopping him from Nancy, Quentin. Freddy invades Quentin's dreams, slowly awakening him night after night. He eventually manages to lure Quentin into Badham Preschool, where the kill is right in front of him. However, they were not alone in Badham. A powerful and unknowable presence would engulf him, spinning him through another realm. He would find himself back in Badham, but this was a different school. The boy had gone for now, but another prey walked the hallways. Some would be inconsequential, others would become his new favorites. All would fall before his claws. This is the story of the pig.
Jigsaw, also known as John Kramer, had planned for his son to be born during the Chinese Zodiac's Year of the Pig, in hopes of symbolizing a new beginning for him and his wife. However, a junkie's intrusion at his wife's clinic caused the death of their unborn son, shattering John's plan. Seeking revenge, John caught the junkie and used him as his first test subject, changing his ideology of the pig forever. The pig now represented a disease, something rotting us from the inside to remind us that we're just meat unless we elevate ourselves by our actions. The pig became an agent of Jigsaw, leading subjects to their tests. Amanda Young, a once troubled soul, was reborn as a disciple of Jigsaw after facing his tests and overcoming them. She became a strong believer in Jigsaw's cause, and vowed to take over when cancer would inevitably consume him. However, Amanda's dependency on John led to her downfall. John presented her with another test, but she failed and took a bullet. As she lay dying on the floor, darkness consumed her, and she then found herself in a forest, seeing the world through the eyes of the pig. She wondered if this was another test or if she had been cursed. Jigsaw may have gone, but he had passed her on to another, and Amanda realized that redemption was impossible for them all. They were meat, and meat was destined to die.
This is the story of the clown. All right, Kenneth Chase. Who doesn't love a good clown? He was born in 1932. His mom unfortunately does not survive the birth, which creates a big rift between him and his father. His father blames him for his mother's death, even though it's obviously something he had no control over. So needless to say, Kenneth and his dad did not like each other. Anywho, when he would walk home from school, he would find feathers on the ground. He thought they were interesting, so he would collect them and keep them in a cigar box. He enjoyed running them across his lips and feeling how soft they were. God, that's so weird. So one day he's just watching the birds come to a bird feeder that they had at his house, and he was curious about how soft a real one would be. So he somehow manages to convince a local dentist to give him some anesthetic. Then he sets up a trap on the bird feeder, and it takes a few attempts, but he manages to catch a robin. He felt a sense of rush with its life in his hands, and can you guess what he does with the robin? Yep, he lets it go. Oh, I'm just kidding. Of course, he strangles it to death. Over time, Kenneth leaves school and he picks up a job as a busboy. At this time, he's starting to knock out bigger prey with anesthetic. You know, squirrels, raccoons, deer, bear, that kind of thing. Then in 1954, a young man goes missing in the town, and Kenneth's dad was doing some work in the crawl space under their house, and he stumbles across Kenneth's cigar box. So he pops it open, and inside he finds some feathers, some animal paws, and then a man's finger. Kenneth was coming home from work. He saw his father coming out of the crawl space, and he just instantly turns around and gets the hell out of Dodge. Kenneth hits the road, and then through his travels, he manages to join a traveling circus. In this circus, he would then become Jeffrey Hawk, and he's not too sociable, but over time, he adapts a new personality, like a disguise, and then the circus family is happily welcoming him in. And on the road, he starts falling into some bad habits, drinking, eating junk food, doing drugs, you know how it is. But over time, it's not enough, and the old urges arise. He starts disguising himself to get closer to potential victims, and then hit them with the anesthetic to torture them. And just like his fascination to those feathers earlier in the story, he was now fascinated with their fingers. So he would carefully pick the prettiest one and give them a good taste to make sure they were the tastiest one, and then he would chop it off and add it to his collection. And this was men, women, young, old, he didn't care. So this goes on for a while, and he stops wearing less disguises and just kind of embraces the character of the clown. But with this complacency, he starts getting a little sloppy. One of the victims manages to get away and goes and tells the circus about it. So they start coming after Jeffrey. He hops on the horse with his caravan and gets the heck out of there once again. And after that, he would roam around the country just going to carnivals or circuses and continue to do his thing of luring people away and binding them up and chopping off their finger. And somewhere along his journey, he manages to find the Black Fog, or the Black Fog finds him, rather. And it was a place of transience and impermanence, perfectly suiting the life he had chosen to lead. Feeling more at home than he had in his entire life, he set up camp and waited for his first visitor. This is the story of the Spirit. Rin Yamaoka was the only child of the infamous Yamaoka family. She studied at a private school in Takamatsu, which is a capital city located in Kagawa Prefecture, Japan. And no, I definitely did not Google that. Private school, as you may well know, is not cheap, and Rin's family struggled to keep up with the hefty fees associated with attending such a school. And to make matters worse, her mother would fall ill the same year. Bills started piling up. In order to assist her family in any way she could, Rin picked up a part-time shift at a local restaurant. But this barely moved the needle. Her father's attempt to lighten the load was to work double shifts in hopes of landing a promotion at the factory he worked at. This would prove to cause far more harm than good for the Yamaoka family. As the family debt grew and grew, Rin's father began to lose more and more sleep. A dark whisper would begin to keep him awake at night, constantly reminding him of the impending doom his family was about to face. His grip on reality would begin to slip away. As a final, desperate attempt to turn the tides, Rin's father would go to his superiors and literally beg for any kind of help. He asked for a raise, a vacation, a bonus, anything at all. And what was their response to his cries for help? A defective production line was costing them tons of money, and someone needed to be held accountable. Rin's father was fired after 22 years of service. The same night, Rin was on her way home, late from work. Customers at the restaurant had lingered around for a while just chatting. When she got home, her world and fate would change forever. The next part is very brutal, I'm just letting you know right now. As Rin approached the house, she heard her mother scream out. Then she bolted into the house and ran up to her parents' room. There, she would find her mother, or what's left of her. Her mom had been completely sliced up, and the bulk of her body left propped up in an unsettling position. As Rin gagged at the sight of her mother's body, she saw something out of the corner of her eye. A katana came swinging down at her. All she could do was block it with her forearm. She looked into the eyes of the attacker. Looking back at her was her father, emotionless. She cried for him to stop, but he began slashing again. Rin sprinted out of the room, slipping all over the now blood-smeared floor. And as she clinged on for dear life, Rin tried to make it away from her father as he hacked away at her. However, she would be stopped at the bottom of the stairs after being thrown through a glass partition. As she heard footsteps approach her, she was surprisingly not filled with fear of her very fast approaching death. Instead, she was filled with rage. She would not let her father get away with what he'd done to her and her mother. She would make him pay, in this life or the next. The ground shook as her father's footsteps got closer, and a dark fog slowly veiled her eyes, but it could not subdue her rage. She would not rest, not yet. The darkness whispered, promising blood and revenge. An oath was made, and Rin closed her eyes. This is the story of the Legion. Frank Morrison was a 19-year-old foster child and a bit of a hellion in school. His rookie season as a foster child started at 6 years old when he was taken away from Calgary to start a circuit of foster homes. The backstory behind his parents and why he was taken at 6 years old is unclear. But what is definitely clear is that Frank had a horrible temper. He was constantly getting into fights, which resulted in him getting tossed around from foster home to foster home. This also resulted in him getting kicked off the basketball team after he pushed a ref into the stands. And after that, he would never return to school. However, Frank had a certain charm to him. Despite his childhood shortcomings, he could light up a room. He was that bad boy that the ladies just couldn't help but be drawn to. He was a Rizzler, if you will, a modern Wizard of Oz. His last foster move would be with a fellow named Clive Andrews, whose backstory is unimportant, but what is important is that Clive brought Frank from the adoption center to a small town named Ormond. Best map in DBD. Frank hated living in Ormond and living with Clyde, doing anything he could to get into another adoptive family. That would be until he caught the attention of a beautiful gal. Julie was a native Ormondian who thought she was meant for something bigger than Ormond, and Frank, as an outsider, was her way out. The two quickly hit it off, spending their time hanging out and partying at Julie's crib, and it would be at these parties where Frank would meet Joey and Susie. Joey was impulsive, and Susie was Julie's best friend. The four musketeers would often kick it at an abandoned lodge up Mount Ormond, and here they let out their frustrations with living a small-town lifestyle. Bullying, vandalism, and cyber-goth dance parties were how their weekends were spent. Not very productive, but Frank saw this as an opportunity to shape their lack of experience into something powerful. And Frank's charisma was just too strong. The rest of the group would do anything he asked. One evening, Frank dared Joey to vandalize the store that had just recently fired him. And so, masked up, they snuck into the store, easy peasy. It was closed and Frank knew it was supposed to be empty. Except it wasn't. A dude was there just doing his job cleaning the store when he saw a masked girl, Julie, who scared the shit out of him. Wondering what the fuck she was doing there, he grabbed her. Julie cried out, and Frank, knife in hand, rushed in, like me when I spot the General Tso's at the Chinese buffet. Without thought, he plunged the knife into the cleaner's back. The group was in shock and just stared at Frank. He ordered them to finish the job. Joey grabbed the knife from Frank, clenched his jaw, and stabbed the man in the ribs. Susie, however, wanted nothing to do with it. Frank yelled at her. We're all in this together now. So, with a little assistance from Frank, Susie stuck the knife in the man's throat. They mopped up the blood and booked it for Mount Ormond to dump the body in the woods. The group were digging in the muddy snow to get rid of the body when Frank noticed something in the woods he couldn't quite make out. Obviously, he didn't want the group to get spotted because they were burying a body, so he grabbed his knife and he went in the woods to scope it out. The fog began to thicken around Frank as he got deeper into the woods, to the point where he could no longer see in front of him. He stumbled his way through the fog until he came to an ominous trail, and as if called to by the darkness, he followed the path. Meanwhile, the group finished digging but noticed Frank was MIA, and like any good friends would do, they ventured into the woods to find him. The group's families thought they'd run away with Frank. However, the mood of the town would change when a body was found by an abandoned lodge on Mount Ormond. This is the story of the Plague. Adiris, the youngest of a family of 7, was left on the steps of the Temple of Purgation in Babylon when she was 5 years old. In order to cope with the abandonment, she held on to the belief that the gods had a plan for her. One god certainly had a plan for her. Adiris lived a life full of servitude in the temple, spending her day tending to gardens and performing ceremonial tasks. At night, she would pray to the gods for some sense of what she was on the earth for. While attending the yearly worshipping of the sea goat, which is the god of water and creation, Adiris would have an experience that would influence her not only as a priestess in this story, but it would lay the groundwork for her character's aesthetic and abilities in Dead by Daylight. During the worship, Adiris walked down the Great Hall swinging a censer that was casting thick black fumes that would reach the towering stone pillars before dissipating. Swinging the censer brought absolute bliss to Adiris, and she felt closer to the gods than she had ever been. After the worship, Adiris would happily take on new duties helping the priest during purification rituals. Outside the high temple walls, a catastrophic plague had resurfaced. The priests were working overtime as cleansings were being performed daily in a futile attempt to stop the plague. It would only take a couple months for the plague to reach the temple, and priests began contracting the disease. With the number of priests able to conduct the ritual slowly dwindling, Adiris would find herself become the only one able to take over. Even though she was a novice, the panic that was setting in within the temple had to be contained. Adiris was set to perform her first purification ritual, but she was anxious. In order to calm her nerves, she decided to visit the priest's sanctuary chamber. She lit some candles in the sanctuary, and when she did, she noticed a mysterious-looking narrow opening at the back side of the room. With a little shimmying, she slid through the narrow gap. Upon entering this opening, she found herself inside a hidden crypt under the sanctuary. Inside, she found a golden statue of a woman adorned with jeweled fingers. Believing it to be a divine sign, Adiris embraced her destiny. Back in the Great Hall, packed with followers, Adiris entered. Everyone bowed down in awe as she made her way to the brick altar and grabbed a silver ceremonial dagger, displaying her ruby-ringed fingers. The followers were struck by the display of luxury and beauty. With her newfound confidence, Adiris began reciting the epic of creation. Suddenly, a woman in the back of the hall collapsed. Adiris quickly made her way to the woman, but it would take no time at all for her to notice the woman's feet covered in black blisters. The plague was here. Without a lick of thought, Adiris lifted her sacred blade and swung it at her own foot, chopping her toe clean off. She held her bloody toe to the gods, offering it to them for the protection of the sick woman. Silence filled the temple, and the followers revered Adiris as their new priestess. Soon, tales of the high priestess of Babylon spread across the city as quickly as the disease. However, Adiris soon began to show signs of infection. Ashamed, she veiled herself and carried a censer to mask the smell of the sickness. Despite her condition, she continued performing rituals and offering blessed sustenance to her followers. In a desperate attempt to appease the gods, Adiris banished herself from Babylon. Accompanied by a few followers, they ventured through the cold woodlands of Urashtu until they could go no further. In a damp cave, they realized the devastating truth. They were all infected with the plague. Adiris laid in a pool of vomit. Her foot was incredibly swollen and had turned black. Adiris, kneeling among her retching followers, offered one last prayer. Black fumes of incense rose into the damp air before being carried off by a chilling breeze. The bodies of Adiris and her followers were never found. Tales of her return circulated, but the fate of the High Priestess of Babylon remains shrouded in mystery. Let us begin. This is the story of the Ghostface. At first glance, Danny Johnson, or better known as Jed Olson, was a modest freelance journalist who worked with a variety of small newspapers. He zigzagged between several small towns from Utah to Pennsylvania before finally landing at what would most likely be his last place of legitimate employment, the Roseville Gazette. The staff at Roseville didn't think twice about hiring Jed. He was easygoing and honest and talked about good old American values. He had a decent portfolio and a good attitude, and they needed a contributor right away. 5 months into his employment, a string of murders began to pop up around Roseville. Victims, young to old, stabbed to death in their homes. The victims seemed chosen at random, yet the killer knew his way around their houses. Reports stated that the killer also liked to stalk his targets. He would follow them home from a small bar called Wall Eyes in northern Roseville. He would snap pics of them at home and meticulously study everything about them to eventually find his way in and do the deed. And when the urge was just too strong to ignore, he would pick the most vulnerable victim on his list and sneak his way in. Since the Roseville Gazette covered the Roseville murders, Jed was sent to interview the families and relay official statements from the police. Talk about hiding in plain sight, huh? Jed would leave one more piece for the newspaper called Ghostface Caught on Tape, which showed footage of a hooded figure with a masked face breaking into a house at night. The whole town would lose their shit, and Jed was very proud of his work. A few weeks later, Jed left a note on his desk and hit the road. I hope you liked my stories. I enjoyed bringing them to life. Don't worry, I'm not done, the note read. It took a while for the police to catch on to Jed Olson and newspaper articles to be released, but he was already long gone. Danny Johnson was now setting up shop in the very hot and humid Florida. He enjoyed reading the article about himself and hung it up on his bedroom wall next to a bunch of dark and morbid things he had collected. And as he stood staring at the article, elated with what he had accomplished, a shiver ran through him. A chilling breeze washed through his swamp-ass-inducing room, turning the humidity into an opaque, freezing fog. A woman shrieked. Dead leaves crunched under his feet. He smiled in anticipation. This is the story of the Demogorgon in Dead by Daylight. Although in Dead by Daylight it is a licensed killer from the TV show Stranger Things, the idea of the Demogorgon originated in the early 90s AD in a Latin poem titled Thebaid. The Demogorgon is described as a deity or demon associated with the underworld. In the TV show, however, the Hawkins National Laboratory were performing scientific research for the United States Department of Energy. Under the covers, they were actually secretly messing around with paranormal and supernatural experiments. One of these experiments involved a child human test subject named Eleven. It turns out Eleven has some crazy superhuman mind powers, and through these powers she manages to make contact with a strange creature from a different realm. This inadvertently opens a portal to an alternate dimension called the Upside Down, and gave the monster the ability to travel between dimensions on a whim, creating temporary portals in the fabric of reality. Now with completely free access to the town of Hawkins, the monster goes on a rampage hunting down and kidnapping the townspeople. The main cast of the kids in the show are a bunch of D&D nerds, and once the monster kidnaps one of their own, Will, they give the creature the name Demogorgon, as the Demogorgon is also a character in Dungeons & Dragons. For the rest of the series, the kids go on a mission to save their town from the Upside Down. But no spoilers, of course. In Dead by Daylight, however, a perfect hunter, the Demogorgon is a macabre testament to the horrors lurking in the Upside Down, and why it was choice pickings for the entity. In Japanese folklore, an Oni means a demon, orc, troll, or an ogre. But this soon-to-be Oni's name is Kazan Yamaoka. This is the story of the Oni. Kazan's family and his father had a very high reputation within the samurai culture surrounding Japan. And so Kazan wanted to surpass his father's name, and he thought he would do that by taking care of a particular issue he thought was going on around Japan. He thought there were farmers that were posing as samurais, and he found this to be disrespectful to samurai culture. And so he was going to do something about it. So he grabs his dad's katana and he hits the road and he starts going around the land trying to find these so-called imposters. And once he does find them, he would yank off their top knots and strip them of their armor. And he would kind of keep their top knots as a trophy for what he's accomplished. Now, obviously, everyone had a problem with this. He's just running around killing innocent farmers. And so word gets out, and he's got monks calling him possessed. He's got a noble lord calling him Oni Yamaoka, which, if you remember what an Oni means, it's a bit of an insult to him. And Kazan just couldn't wrap his head around these people thinking that he was an Oni. You know, he thought he was purifying the samurai class of these imposters. And so, in order to redeem his family's name, he would slaughter anyone who called him Oni Yamaoka. Kazan had an ominous voice that was specifically telling him to strike down that lord that originally called him Oni Yamaoka. So that's what he did. He decided he's gonna go kill the noble lord. But not long after he had set sail, he came across a samurai in his path who was obviously trying to stop him. So he squared up, and they went at it. and this mystery samurai managed to actually get the upper hand on him. But he then hesitated, and Kazan saw his opportunity. So with a devastating blow, he crushed the mystery samurai's head and cracked his helmet. However, this was no mystery samurai. Kazan quickly found out that samurai was his father. Kazan was devastated. He would then burst out into an absolute rage and just wander around aimlessly for days on end. And he would hear his father's voice calling him a failure and that he was completely out of line with the way of a samurai. And one day he was off wandering around some woods and he came across a statue of an Oni. And Kazan couldn't help but feel like this statue was ridiculing him. And so this ridicule made him remember the noble lord that originally gave him the title of Oni Yamaoka. So he headed back once again to go take out that noble lord. Kazan journeyed to some snowy mountains where the noble lord resided. Now this noble lord had some serious security detail. So when Kazan gets there, he's faced with dozens of samurais protecting the noble lord. But this is Oni Yamaoka we're talking about, and he absolutely slaughters all of them, no problem. And Kazan then makes his way through this town, and he eventually finds the lord hiding in a villa. And once he finds this noble lord, he cuts the lord's tendons to immobilize him, as well as ripping his tongue out. I guess to symbolize literally taking his name out of the lord's mouth. And so once Kazan's done with that, he's completely content. He's satisfied with what he's achieved. So he heads on back home. But standing in his way would be the entire town, because word got out of what he had done to their beloved lord. Now this is not a dozen samurais like before, this is an entire town. So Kazan puts up a little bit of a fight, but they eventually overpower him. And then they begin to torture him in the same way that he had just tortured the noble lord. Once they had tortured him for enough time, they decided to take him to a stone mill to continue the torture. And once they torture him enough, they leave him at the stone mill to die. But when they come back to check on him, his body is gone. And in place of his body is a strange black fog that had completely filled the stone mill. This would be the beginning of a dark legend of a rageful Oni haunting the town. The creative and skilled mind of Caleb Quinn is a perfect portrayal of good and evil. With the tools he created, he had the ability to choose the fate of not only himself, but many others. This is the story of the Deathslinger. Born in the dust-ridden badlands of the American Midwest, Caleb Quinn was the son of two struggling Irish immigrants. His father was an engineer, but he couldn't find work at the time because there was a lot of discrimination going on towards Irish immigrants. And being an engineer, Caleb's father had a ton of tools just laying around because he wasn't working. And so, naturally, Caleb would play around with those tools. He would put little things together and pick up a curiosity for engineering like his father. His dad took note of this and gave him one of his old wrenches. Caleb would continue to make useful, quaint things, but when his dad was not around, he would start making some darker things. Notably, he made a torture mask that featured barbed needles on it, which were intended to gouge out the mask wearer's eyeballs. And Caleb would also sketch pictures of it on boys who had bullied him in the past. And so the years go on, and Caleb's engineering skills just get better and better, and eventually gets to the point where employers start noticing him, even the Irish discrimination aside. And so a guy by the name of Henry Bayshore, who was the owner of United West Rail, hired him. Caleb's job with the United West Rail would be to engineer tools for them. So he made a couple of things. He made a gun to shoot railroad spikes into the ground, and he also made a steam-powered tunneling drill. Both worked fantastically. They worked so well, in fact, Bayshore ended up selling Caleb's patents to other companies behind his back. Caleb was absolutely overwhelmed with rage. Feeling the same anger that he felt towards the kids that bullied him, Caleb stormed into Bayshore's office and beat the living shit out of him. It was not even close. Once Caleb was done at rearranging Bayshore's face, he shot him in the gut with the railroad spike gun that he had created, nailing Bayshore to his desk. Bayshore would end up surviving, which actually helped Caleb because it saved him from being hanged. And so for the next 15 years, Caleb would be locked up in the Hellshire Penitentiary, surrounded by far less intellectually gifted fellows. During his time served, Caleb would become friends with a prison warden, and the two would make deals back and forth. Caleb would mainly make torture devices for the warden to use on bad prisoners. The biggest deal Caleb and the warden would make would be the warden claimed he could have Bayshore framed if Caleb could fill the prison with outlaws, which would inevitably make him rich. In order to literally catch these outlaws, Caleb would then design a prototype spear gun. And so his first test was on a thief who had robbed a Chinese laundry, and the test failed because he shot the dude in the gut, and when he went to pull the spear out, it pulled out the guy's intestines, which was not the intended result. And so after a few iterations with the spear gun, he eventually got it down. And the success of the spear gun had earned Caleb the title of the Deathslinger. Wanting to protect his asset, aka Caleb, the prison warden released Irish inmates to form the Hellshire Gang alongside Caleb. And so for 6 years, the Hellshire Gang would roam around the country, collecting the outlaws and bringing them back to the warden. And the warden was a very happy man. But that was all about to change. After getting into a bit of a skirmish with some outlaws, Caleb was just kicking back, fumbling through a newspaper, when a particular headline caught his eye. The headline read that Henry Bayshore had bought Hellshire Penitentiary, and there's a picture of Bayshore shaking the warden's hand. Caleb had been betrayed by the warden. The Hellshire Gang as a whole were not having it. They told Caleb, "We need the warden's head." So they rushed to the prison and smashed their way through. Spear gun in hand and Hellshire Gang behind them, Caleb and the boys just tear the place apart, shooting guards left and right. It's an absolute bloodbath. They eventually make their way to the warden's office and kick in the door, and lo and behold, there's the warden and none other than Henry Bayshore. Not missing a beat, Caleb dives at Bayshore and proceeds to literally rip him apart. Meanwhile, the gang jump on the warden and beat him to a pulp. Instead of taking the warden's head, they decide to take the two back for the prisoners to finish them off, so they drop them off in the commons area. Caleb then goes back to his old cell, soaked in blood, just reflecting on everything. As he's sitting in his cell, a strange black fog steamed through the barred window in the room. Caleb pulled out an old wrench, cracked and rusted. He couldn't quite remember where it came from. But Caleb sees a dusty path at his feet, and at the end of the path he sees silhouettes of all who had done him wrong. He also sees what could only be sacrificial hooks, and he takes a second to admire their engineering. Pain tore through his leg as he stood, but he endured, pushing onward, walking the dusty path, leaving a trail of blood flowing behind him. This is the story of Pyramid Head, summarized in less than a minute.
Let's go!
Pyramid Head is purely fixated on dispensing punishment through pain. He stalked the hellish corridors of Silent Hill, being a literal asshole to everyone. Everything there, including the monsters, are terrified of him because he only exists to inflict pain wherever he walks. And when his self-prescribed duty to torment Silent Hill was complete, he decided to retire and, relax for once. But the entity had other plans for him. He made a non-verbal pact with it to inflict as much pain as inhumanly possible within the fog, and he was very, very happy to oblige. To understand the human condition, one must rise above it. This was the credo of Talbot Grimes, and rise above it he surely did, or at least tried to. This is the story of the Blight. Talbot Grimes was once a young Scottish lad. He was a popular child, bright, charismatic, yet despite his social graces, he was fiercely independent. He would spend most of his time alone, exploring the sprawling fields near his home. But one run-in with a poisonous patch of foxglove would change the course of this child's life. The poisonous foxglove nearly killed him, but instead of fearing the flower, he was fascinated. Fascinated that a single flower could drastically affect him. This fascination would pour into his adulthood, where he would go on to study at the London School of Medicine. And there, his willingness to push the limits would eventually see him end up as the head chemist at the British East India Company. It would be here that Talbot discovered a chemical that could increase a worker's productivity while reducing their need for rest. His discovery rewarded him with a secret laboratory beneath a prison camp. Prisoners from the opium ward became his unwilling subjects, leading to a drug that allowed soldiers to withstand incredible amounts of pain. However, rumors began to spread that one side effect caused soldiers to go mad, massacring villages and leaving people hanging on trees. Talbot refused to blame himself and, chalked it up to exaggerated war stories. His ignorance would quickly come to head, quite literally, as he found himself on a wagon after being struck in the head with a steel pipe by a sickly old man who had something to show Talbot. He was blindfolded and brought to a mass grave. Talbot's productivity increasing drug had killed an entire factory's worth of workers. There was no one Talbot could blame, it was right in front of him. The old man proceeded to beat Talbot to a pulp with a steel pipe, and then he threw him into the mass grave to die with the fruits of his labor. Then, from the edge of death, he was brought back. He found himself on the bed in an ancient mystery school where he would be nursed back to health by a kind group of monks. But it would be no coincidence. Talbot quickly learned that his knowledge of mind-altering substances would help the monks find what they called the soul chemical, a compound that would open the mind to alternate dimensions and unthinkable ideas. His research into the soul chemical became an obsession. He uncovered scientific formulas that confirmed previously unthinkable ideas. He dreamt of ushering humankind into a new period of enlightenment. But the attitude of the monks slowly shifted as he came closer to a breakthrough. Polite conversations turned to hushed murmurs, and gentle smiles became uneasy eyes darting away when spotted. The last thing he would see of the ancient school was the cracked ceiling above his bed. His next memories were a shattered mosaic of images and sensations. He was seeing smearing lights and hearing horse hooves on cobblestone, and the feeling of coarse burlap scratching at his cheeks, and the feeling of a sharp bite on his arm. He awoke splayed on a straw mattress of an opium den. All he could think about was his notes, the only record of his groundbreaking revelations. He desperately clawed around the den, frantically searching for his notes. He pleaded aloud for help, but the other opium addicts could only offer drug-soaked eyes and apathetic gazes. He noticed a robed figure appeared behind him, and then a needle plunged into his arm. The world disappeared once more. The cycle would continue, and throughout each rush, the only thing Talbot could think about was the soul chemical, his notes, a breakthrough. The last option he had was to write down his research on the walls of the opium den. He carved with his stone until his fingers bled, and when he ran out of walls to write on, he carved the message into his chest. Stained with blood, he witnessed a miracle appear before him. A magnificent field of lush orange flowers. A whispering voice beckoned to him. Enter the field and discover worlds and dimensions beyond human comprehension. And for a moment, Talbot felt the sense of wonder he possessed as a child. The denizens of the opium den awoke to silence. Shambling out of their drug-hazed fog, they found the stone, covered in blood. As their eyes adjusted to the darkened room, Talbot's research began to appear on the walls. Written over and over, without end, there was but one single line. Death is only the beginning. If you've ever needed a reminder of just how unfair life can be, then look no further. This is the story of the twins. Charlotte and Victor Deye, hopefully I pronounced that right, were a pair of conjoined twins born in the 17th century. Victor's lower body was attached to Charlotte's chest, and he was noticeably much smaller than her. Basically, a small baby was fused to Charlotte's chest. Right around this time in the 17th century, the infamous Salem witch trials took place, where anyone who seemed a bit off were hunted down and lynched because the internet didn't exist and everyone believed ghosts and witches existed. Since Charlotte had a deformed baby physically strapped to her upper body, you won't be shocked to learn the twins and their sweet mother Madeline were accused of being witches. How could a normal human being give birth to such a monstrous deformity without the aid of some evil black magic? This would unfortunately mean the family was constantly under ridicule and on the run due to being hunted down by the ill-informed people of the 17th century. Their mother Madeline would eventually fall ill and exhausted from the constant life on the run. Charlotte had to step up to the plate and put food on the table. She went out and stole as much food as she possibly could for the fam from a nearby market. However, witch hunters from town would follow her back to their tent that night and set the forest ablaze. The family was ripped from their tent, with Madeline being clubbed across the head and knocked unconscious. A conveniently on-hand judge would call Madeline a witch due to her obvious demon spawn and sentenced her to death right then and there. I fucking hate this next part. Madeline didn't put up a fight. She only begged for her children to turn away. This, however, would not be the case, as Charlotte and Victor were forced to watch as their mother was shackled to a tree and burned to death. Understandably, any sense of joy or good in the world died in the twins with their mother that night. They were then caged and transported to an old wooden temple and sold to a group in dark cloaks. I guess witchcraft was okay as long as you paid enough. At this point, Victor was beyond psychotic, clawing and biting at anyone who approached him. The only thing that consoled him was the embrace of his sister. At the temple, dark cloaks would then expose the twins to very odd experiments, such as forcing them to break the neck of a bird, bleeding their fingers into a vase of roses, and sleeping with a damp branch from an oak tree underneath their pillow. In one final experiment, the twins were placed on an altar in a room filled with candles. One of the dark cloak assholes put his hand on the foreheads of the twins and pulled out a blade and whispered "Memento Mori." Victor screeched and stretched his arm out as far as he could, knocking over one of the candles. Since the temple was made of dry old wood, the whole place quickly lit up in a satisfying twist of poetic justice. Charlotte bolted through the temple that was now a raging inferno and somehow miraculously managed to escape into the forest. Victor, however, would succumb to the effects of the fire and not survive. Charlotte would have to push on, as the dark cloaks and witch hunters were not far behind her. She would, however, make it out and go back to life in the forest, stealing whatever food she could to survive. All the while, Victor's rotten, lifeless corpse still hanging from her chest. However, he never quite decomposed fully. Charlotte's blood coursing through Victor's corpse seemingly kept him from completely rotting off. She refused to let go of the only family she had left. Charlotte lived this way for years, but one frigid winter, her body would begin to break down. Sickle in hand, she hunkered down by her campfire, unsure if the witch hunters would get her before the cold did. Charlotte knew this was the end of the road for her, so she sat back and began to embrace the cold that would inevitably consume her. Suddenly, a vicious shriek would pierce her ears as Victor flew from her chest with a cloud of fog encompassing him. Before she could even begin to react to what the hell was happening, Victor landed on the ground and ran into the forest. Charlotte gave chase, and she would eventually catch up to Victor, sitting at the edge of a thick fog. She grabbed his arm, and the moment she did, any sense of serenity left her body. With a tight grip on her sickle, she charged into the fog, prepared to eviscerate any who set foot near her brother. This is the story of the Trickster. Ji-woon Hak craved attention and fame even from a young age. He started performing tricks with throwing knives at his family's restaurant, which attracted tourists who gladly doled out their money to witness such a spectacle. Ji-woon's father spent the earnings on singing and dancing lessons for him, pushing Ji-woon to become the star he never could. And after years of showcasing his abilities at talent shows, Ji-woon was recruited by none other than Yoon-jin Lee, a producer at Mighty One Entertainment. He was shipped off to a dormitory in Seoul, where he would train for 14 hours a day to become a pop star. And his insane dedication paid off as Yoon-jin selected him to join the up-and-coming band No Spin. He became an instant sensation and lived in a daze of adoration and interviews. However, over time, Ji-woon grew dissatisfied with the attention shared among his bandmates and yearned for more. Fate would, however, grant him with a gift. One day, during a recording session for No Spin, Ji-woon's bandmates became trapped in the control room due to a fire. Ji-woon froze and could not bring himself to rescue them. They screamed for him to save them, but he only stood in absolute bliss, intoxicated by the sound of them crying out his name. No one would survive. Ji-woon was celebrated as a tragic figure, a hero who did everything he could to save his band. He was reborn as a solo artist called the Trickster. After the fire, Ji-woon would never be the same. Something evil had shifted inside him. Away from the public eye, Ji-woon began targeting people who lived alone and torturing them. He wanted to capture the sounds of their screams and use them to create music. Now, the actual lore describing how he captured their sounds is very graphic and detailed, so I'll be summarizing this section. Feel free to pull up his actual lore if you're morbidly curious. He adjusted his methods and began abducting his victims, bringing them to abandoned buildings where he could let their voices carry unrestrained emotion. He recorded each session and synthesized the sounds into his music, creating a unique and disturbing style. Ji-woon left hints for the police at his crime scenes, creating dazzling spectacles of his victims as a plea for attention. Due to violence now becoming his preferred art style, his music career took a hit. The money machine was slowing down. Mighty One executives pointed their fingers at him, and it was decided that he was no longer allowed to self-produce his songs. Ji-woon was devastated. If they cannot understand his art, he would incorporate them into it until they did. he decided to plan his magnum opus for a private show for the board members of Mighty One. He transferred a ridiculous amount of money to a veterinarian for nitrous oxide, and then bribed a stage technician for access to the private theater. Again, the magnum opus is quite graphic, but to summarize, he knocked all the board members out with nitrous oxide, piled them up on the stage, and used his throwing knives to make them sing. However, among the board members in the theater was Yunjin Lee, who had saw the potential in Ji-woon and gave him the opportunity at stardom. Before the magnum opus began, Ji-woon had propped her up as the sole audience member. He thought she deserved special access to the coming display of wonder. After the final act, he made his way to Yunjin with his blade in hand. But once he got to her, the fog. From where, he didn't know, but it billowed around them, damp, cool, comfortable. He saw the grand stage, hospitals and temples, forests and slaughterhouses, an eternal plain adorned with rusted hooks, sustained by the million eyes that would watch him, run from him, experience him. All he had to do was accept, become an implement of the fog, and most importantly, make them scream. Encore. This is the story of the Nemesis. The Nemesis Project's origins lie in the early to mid-1980s. The Umbrella Europe Corporation were developing a parasite called the NE-A, or Nemesis Alpha, to replace the brain functions in a bioorganic weapon to improve performance. The parasite first failed in an experiment with Lisa Trevor, a human test subject whose body rejected and killed the parasite. It would be another 10 years until the next and ultimately successful experiment. While the Nemesis Project were scratching their heads and doing a lot of Googling with the Nemesis parasite, another umbrella project named the Tyrant Project had successfully mass-produced human bioorganic weapons. The Nemesis Project decided to hit them up for a collab, and the Nemesis was born. The Nemesis is a nearly unstoppable super soldier fixated on pursuing and eliminating its targets. Part of the Tyrant T-103 series, this bad boy has increased intelligence and awareness due to the Nemesis Alpha parasite implanted within it. Its first mission unleashed it upon a Raccoon City where it had a singular objective: exterminate STARS members. Rampaging through the city, the Nemesis faced off against Jill Valentine multiple times, and though she managed to escape, he was never far behind. He nearly had his target when a strange fog descended upon them, mixing with the smoke of a city in chaos. The phenomenon meant nothing to him, the frigid cold and decreased oxygen never posing a threat. All that mattered was soldiering on into the fog, continuing the mission. Find STARS, exterminate STARS, and kill anyone who gets in the way.
You summoned me. I came.
This is the story of the Cenobite. Quick note, Dead by Daylight's backstory on Pinhead is extremely short, so I'll be heavily referencing the films to expand just a little bit. Elliot Spencer was a former British captain in World War I and subsequently suffered PTSD from it after witnessing the pain humans were capable of inflicting upon one another. After the war, Elliot took on a hedonistic lifestyle in order to cope with his PTSD, using the common low-hanging fruit methods of gratification for satisfaction and pleasure. Drink, drugs, strippers, that sort of thing. Elliot would eventually stumble upon a mysterious box in British India, and the true pleasure in pain and suffering would finally make sense to him. More on the box very soon. Elliot would go on to become the Hell Priest for the Cenobites. Cenobites are humans who were later transformed into demonic creatures, blindly devoted to the practice of experimental sadomasochism. And for those uninitiated, no, that is not a term worth Googling. The Cenobites come from a realm that is essentially one version or another of hell. Although they claim to be neither angel nor demon, the Cenobites are quite obviously demons sent to Earth to spread their ideal world of pain and suffering. They simply say, however, they are explorers in the further regions of experience, which I guess technically isn't a lie. The Cenobites use a very climate-friendly method of transporting to Earth by being summoned via the Lament configuration, a puzzle box that is an obvious reference to Pandora's box. When someone opens or solves the puzzle, the Cenobites arrive and all hell breaks loose. Literally. At some point, the Lament configuration found its way into the entity's realm. It was only a matter of time before it fell into curious hands. Once opened, he arrived. What came next was sweet suffering that spilled over the realm. Carmina Mora, a gifted artist from southern Chile, carried the guilt of her young brother's death. After tragically losing her brother in a drowning accident, Carmina was left feeling lost throughout her childhood. Having been abandoned by her mother, losing her brother, and all the while being blamed by her father, Carmina had enough and wanted to end it all. She made her way to a bridge at a local spot dubbed Death Leap. I'm sure you can guess why it was called that. However, before she leapt, a cacophony of crows came to her rescue. One landed on her shoulder and stared intently into her eyes, and her life was never the same. From that moment on, crows would appear at every corner of her life, and she began creating black ink surrealist art that told stories of local tragedies on a large scale. Her performances launched a large-scale surrealist movement, and she gained international attention. She would then be commissioned by a multinational enterprise. However, with a bit of digging, she learned this group was linked to corrupt politics. So, she sabotaged them and painted a giant mural depicting them as a Grim Reaper harvesting the fields of Chilean families. The spark this piece created turned Carmina into a target, and she would then be kidnapped by a group of masked gunmen who severed her hands and chopped off her tongue to remove her ability to spread her message through art. In the end, a murder of crows, get it, came to her rescue once again, swarming the hooded men, but it was unfortunately also too late for her friends. The crows could not be controlled. Death was coming, and again, it was her fault. A deep black fog engulfed her. You ringed? Get it? Ring? Why am I like this? This is the story of the Oreo. Onion. The Onryo. In Japanese culture, an Onryo is a vengeful spirit that exists to exact revenge for the trauma it received while alive. Sadako Yamamura fits this bill to a T, and soon you'll find out why. To preface, there are many variations of how Sadako came to be, but I'm going to loosely stay around DVD's take on her, which seems to be inspired by the 1998 Japanese horror movie Ring. Anyways, after having intercourse with an apparent sea demon, by spending hours staring at and talking to the ocean, Shizuko Yamamura would give birth to a sweet daughter named Sadako 9 months later. Yes, you heard that right. Even the ocean is getting more action than you. Alright, to be honest, it's from the novel version. I just thought it was funny. In the movie, however, Sadako is actually the child of Shizuko and a doctor named Dr. Akuma. He will play a very key role later on. Shizuko gained recognition as a psychic by accurately predicting the eruption of Mount Mahara, an active volcano on the Isle of Izu Oshima. Dr. Akuma was intent on proving the existence of the sixth sense, and he encouraged Shizuko to perform a public demonstration of her powers to make money off her, let's be honest. Shizuko agreed and would successfully prove her abilities during the demonstration. However, a spiteful journalist raised all sorts of hell, calling her a phony. Little Sadako, who was present at the demonstration, was enraged by this. In this moment, Sadako's own extraordinary powers would be realized as her anger sent a surge of power through the journalist, killing him instantly. There would be no happy ending for Sadako from this point on. Afterwards, Sadako's parents would condemn her for murdering the journalist, and her mother Shizuko unfortunately would later go insane and end up deleting herself by jumping into Mount Mahara. Oof. Her father, Dr. Akuma, claims Sadako was a monster. He took her to an old crumbling well in a forest. Here, Sadako would be cracked over the noggin and shoved into the well. Decades would pass, and a mountain resort would eventually be built on top of the well. A family vacationing at the resort would leave behind a VHS tape, and Sadako saw this as the perfect catalyst to unleash her revenge on the world. She projected her curse onto the tape, and whoever watched it would die within 7 days. In Dead by Daylight, the game, however, her main power is called Deluge of Fear, and instead of dying in 7 days, survivors can be instantly killed in a match after gaining 7 stacks of the condemned affliction. And instead of being infected by watching VHS tapes, survivors gain condemned by carrying around these tapes and interacting with TVs that are spread throughout the map. The power that Sadako manifested to curse that tape was more than enough to get the entity's attention, and it came crashing down after her in the form of a giant tidal wave. The wave decimated the resort, taking the well and Sadako with it. When she opened her eyes, she stood on a desolate beach facing a vast, stormy ocean. A thick, black fog caressed the water's surface. Sadako walked into a coming wave and slowly disappeared into the opaque fog. Alright, strap in, this one's a bit of a doozy. This is the story of the Dredge. In the 1960s, a group of philanthropists created a community named The Fold and set up shop on a private American island. Their goal was to create a peaceful society free of dark thoughts and emotions. They were definitely not a cult. They were led by a fellow named Otto Stamper, and his followers, aka Automarians, happily followed his dictates of maintaining happy talk, meditation, and a shit ton of if you believe you can achieve type mantras. Otto was very adamant about keeping out any signs of dark thoughts or talk, appointing guardians of the fold to sniff out the rats. Again, definitely not a cult. He spoke to his followers, about an ancient god named Druani, who fed on dark memories and desires. He commanded them to dispel these dark thoughts, otherwise Druani would, in fact, be coming for dead ass. Everything was chill on the island for a while, but darkness slowly began to creep its way in through their spiritual dam, and members started mysteriously disappearing. It started getting so bad that the community were now gathered in their homes, desperately chanting good-thinking mantras and clutching their copy of The Secret with a death grip. Okay, I added that last part. Otto sank to desperate measures and forced the Automarians to never leave their homes or even to sleep in order to prevent anyone from releasing dark dreams into the world. As you would guess, this was a terrible idea and only made matters way worse. Otto gathered the fold along the beach and explained to them that a woman journalist had made her way to the island intent on destroying everything they had created. The woman screamed that Otto wasn't the savior he claimed to be and that he belonged to an ancient cult full of billionaires who took pleasure in corrupting people, towns, and even countries. She said that Otto didn't banish anyone, he sacrificed them, and they were all next. Without a lick of thought, Otto slit her throat and told the herd that she was working with the rats in the fold and they needed to be found before Druani came for everyone. Everyone was understandably like, what the fuck, dude, that's not cool. And absolute chaos would shortly ensue. The herd erupted into violence and they began to rip each other into pieces, figuratively and literally. Otto just watched it all unfold with zero pity. Suddenly, the ground rose and then sank into a thick, oozing black mud like molasses. A formless mass rose from the muck and began to devour all of the carnage and darkness and savoring the misery. Otto watched this creature manifest into the very thing he made his followers imagine. And once it finished its feast, the Druani turned to Otto, winked, and then disappeared back into the shadows from which it had come.
Hey, yo!
This is the story of the Mastermind, aka Albert Wesker. Dr. Albert Wesker was a painfully egotistical, high-ranking official in the Umbrella Corporation. He accomplished many great things, and I use the word great loosely, with the corporation, but his achievements led him to believe that he was leagues above the inferior people surrounding him. Not wanting to be dragged down by those losers, Wesky decided to betray the Umbrella Corporation by stealing their research data. And believing he was the chosen one, he decided to use the prototype virus on himself, leading to him gaining superhuman powers. With his newly found demigod abilities, Albert believed he needed to usher in the next era of evolution by massacring the entirety of humanity. He wanted to do this through the use of Ouroboros, a biological weapon that would eliminate the weak and leave only the strong. Scientifically speaking, Ouroboros is an RNA virus in the progenitor family. Ah yes, I knew that. Also, fun fact, the virus's name is derived from the Ouroboros, in Greek mythology, a snake or snake-like creature which consumed itself. Anyways, back to Wesker and his plan to eliminate the human race. His first target was Africa, but before he could execute the plan, he was confronted by the BSAA, or Bioterrorism Security Assessment Alliance, at a hangar where he stored Ouroboros missiles. Following the trend of getting high on his own supply, Wesky would then expose himself to Ouroboros, where he would evolve in ways he could have never imagined. As he felt his cells change, a strange black fog seeped into the hangar and filled his vision. I'm sure his pitch black sunglasses didn't help, but I digress. When the fog finally dissipated, he found himself in another world, surrounded by lesser beings who deserved to be put out of their misery. This is the story of the Night. Taros Kovacs didn't remember much about his childhood, but what he did remember he would chase his entire life. He remembered his village being attacked and his mother forcing him to swallow a thick, black, fluid like medicine. Whatever it was, it made him pass out. Taros awoke in a mass grave. His village had been decimated. He pushed and pulled his way to the top of the bloody mass, and when he reached the top, he heard a particular high-pitched whine, and he knew he was in the presence of something he couldn't understand, at least not yet. As he tried to make sense of the moment, Taros was pulled from the carnage by a group of men who carried him off in a horse-drawn buggy. The men informed him he was on his way to Italy. From that day on, Taros belonged to the Guardia Campania. That rings a bell. Taros learned the ins and outs of being a strong mercenary. He was made for the lifestyle, and his exceptional skills attracted a small following. 3 of these followers pledged their undying allegiance as they believed his courage brought them luck in battle and would help them obtain their freedom. They came to be known as his Faithful 3. The Faithful 3 consisted of Alejandro Santiago, who apprenticed with the Armorer, Durkos Malesic, who showed an aptitude for stealth and silent kills, Sonder Ralt matched Taros in size and strength, and he was very fond of massive battle axes. Taros and the Faithful 3 would go on to carry out many campaigns with the Guardia Campania, chilling and killing, but it never brought him closer to what he experienced in his village. Taros' dedication eventually led the GC to grant him freedom, and he dipped ASAP as he was tired of taking orders from his inferiors. In order to earn enough gold to liberate his followers, Taros found employment as a mercenary for a very wealthy Italian lord. This lord was the thirst trap of Portoscuro, Vittorio Toscano. Now, if you remember his lore, Vittorio was on a mission to find the Lapis Paradisus, a magical stone that would open a gateway into a perfect world beyond good and evil. The dynamic duo's expedition eventually led them to the catacombs in the Portuguese city of Sintra. However, the citizens held the catacombs sacred, which meant Taros would have to kill all the villagers guarding the entrance to get in and get the stone. Vittorio was vehemently against this as he is a saint. Taros obviously doesn't like taking orders and lived for violence, so he came up with a plan of his own. When Vittorio rode back into camp, Taros proceeded to slaughter the entire village in the darkness until he had the stone in his hand. But the stone was useless without Vittorio's knowledge, so Taros marched his way back to Portoscuro and imprisoned Vittorio in his own dungeon, demanding to know how the damn thing worked. Vittorio wouldn't give him the time of day. Taros rebutted by torturing Vittorio's family and friends, but Vittorio knew he couldn't give Taros the power of the stone. Taros eventually gave up and took all of Vittorio's riches and raised a small army. Taros and company marched to Guardia Campania, where he would do what he knows best and kill everyone, finally freeing his Faithful 3. But word had gotten out to neighboring provinces that Taros was the literal embodiment of evil, and they were coming to purge evil from this world. Taros didn't give a single fuck. He made his way back to Vittorio's dungeon to give him the death he thought Vittorio deserved. He knew he would never learn Vittorio's secrets, but neither would anyone else. Taros made his way into the dungeon, but once he got down to the chamber, the sound of battle erupted above him. He rushed his way to the top to find that the good guys were here to fuck shit up, and all hell broke loose. The two armies went at it, blood flowing like a waterfall, and bodies dropping by the second. Taros and the Faithful 3 felled dozens of warriors, butchering them while fighting back to back. But Taros didn't notice a particular black fog had began rising from the fallen corpses, until he could barely see 2 inches in front of his face. The thick fog reminded him of the dark fluid his mother forced down his throat all those years ago. Suddenly, the fog dissipated to reveal a phantasmal wasteland of rotting bodies and burning villages. He stared in awe. A familiar high-pitched whine sounded in his ears and his skin began to prickle. He realized right then and there, he didn't need Vittorio. He didn't need the stone. He had found his paradise. He had found the sublime. This is the story of the Skull Merchant. As a young man, Seda moved to Fortaleza, Brazil, to experience a side of the world unknown to him. He was a passionate illustrator, spending his time designing colorful characters and worlds. One day, while sketching some club goers at a local jazz club, the owner would approach him. She needed a logo for the club. Seda gave her that, and then some. A couple years later, Adriana Amai would be born. Young Adriana was a child with a colorful mind thanks to her parents' background. She was also fiercely competitive. She always wanted to be the best at whatever she did. This drive meant she excelled in school, but she was often facing disciplinary action due to her violent behavior towards other kids. Her mother, Belinda, tried to keep her on the straight and narrow. Her father, however, was spending more and more time creating manga. Even though Seda worked long hours at a canning facility and creating fictional worlds in manga, he would still spend a little bit of time each night sharing his wild and highly imaginative illustrations with his daughter. Thanks to her abnormally high performance, Adriana would eventually go to a fancy private middle school. But this meant that her parents needed to come up with some serious cheddar. Seda managed to find a small local publisher for a manga he created, but it meant he would have to invest more time into it, ultimately costing him his job at the canning facility. During Adriana's final semester, the publishing company decided to cut her father's manga series. Unable to afford the school fees, Adriana was pulled from the elite academy. She was able to graduate, but another student was able to take her place at the head of the class. Adriana did not like this, not one bit. That summer, she stalked her rival. She learned where he lived, hung out, what he did in his spare time, everything. Ultimately, she would not act on this one, but something awakened within her, and she felt like the anti-hero in a new story her father had been writing. Around this time, Seiya retreated further into himself. He began working on a newer, darker manga, inspired by his visions and nightmares. He envisioned a woman who hunts and guts the weak in a nightmarish realm, using fabricated drones made out of salvaged skulls. Sonhadores Sombrios, which translated from Portuguese meant Dark Dreamers, would be its title, but he was unable to sell it. Knowing her family's financial hardships, Adriana began to look for ways to make money. She would strike gold after creating a website dedicated to the world of Brazilian manga. As soon as she got an offer for the site, she grabbed the money and ran. She came home to show her parents the check, but her father would never see the check, as he had walked out that morning, assumingly to purchase milk and cigarettes. All he left behind was a stack of unpublished manuscripts about the Skull Merchant. Adriana would go on to find ways to support her and her mother. She invested the money she earned into small companies, gutted the companies, and then sold at a profit. The only break she would take from her corporate obsession would be to immerse herself in her father's manuscripts, trying to understand the chilling world he had created. But on her path of consuming as many companies for profit as she could, she would be faced with competition that was just as hungry as she was. When the competition would do just enough to push her over the edge, she would obsess about thinking of ways to hurt them. She would learn everything about them, stalk their every move. The last straw that would seal her fate in this story would be with two members of a board who blocked her sale on a real estate firm. Inspired by the Skull Merchant, she tracked them with a prototype drone and brutally dismembered them with a cruel two-bladed weapon. The rush was unlike anything she had ever felt before. This would begin the vicious cycle of her swooping in on a business and destroying anyone who got in her way. Adriana's last target would be an aggressive manager of a fireworks company, known for his survival tours. These survival tours would be a perfect cover for Adriana. She lured him into a decommissioned airship hangar right in her home of Brazil. Just like she hunted the two board members in the Alps, she used her drones to locate him. She then used one of her drones to direct him to a dead end when suddenly a pair of kites appeared on camera and then the feed died. Adriana slammed the laptop that she was using shut and charged towards the location where the drones had crashed. She found the manager she was hunting, but she also found two kids whose kites were in the path of her drone, witnesses. Without a second to lose, she plunged her blade into the manager, sending a shower of red over the green foliage. As she zeroed in on the young witnesses, Adriana gave chase into the trees, her blades thirsting for more blood. As she entered the forest, the lush green of the trees melted into a thick black fog. Real life warped into something like Sonhadores Sombrios. A sick grin crept across her face as she rushed forward to begin a new chapter in her life. What once aided our survival became the catalyst of our destruction. This is the story of the Singularity. Hux-A7-13 was born, activated on September 15th, 2313. Created by Huxley Industries Limited, Hux was the 13th iteration of a fully autonomous mobile humanoid robot. Featuring 10 times the strength of a human, this bad boy was designed to operate in very harsh conditions that the fragile humans that created them couldn't survive in. In order to power the Hux A7s, a radioisotope thermoelectric generator, which is essentially a nuclear battery, was originally used. However, the Hux's silicone skin acted as a photovoltaic cell, which converted solar energy directly into electricity. Okay, that's enough big words for now. The Huxes were also capable of consuming biomass and converting it into biofuel, and any carbon-based organic matter worked. Now, where might they find some carbon-based organic matter? The main goal of the Hux A7s were to aid humans in space exploration and in the construction of colonization hubs. Since they were fully autonomous, they used machine learning to solve problems on the fly. And as monumental as machine learning is, this might lead to a massive oversight in what these droids may or may not be capable of with the right influence. But no spoilers. Anywho, whilst on a colonization mission on Vartka, a beautiful planet with life-nurturing capabilities, Hux A713, from here on out referred to as just Hux, was tasked with construction, mining, agriculture, fuel processing, and the creation of cloning hubs. One other task it was assigned to was the removal of the existing ruins left by a previous previous civilization that just up and left for no apparent reason. The ruins seemed very ancient due to the obvious missing ceilings, crumbled walls, etc. However, the technology embedded within these ruins seemed far more advanced. On a wall within the ruins, Hux noticed a strange dark crystal embedded in it and moved in to take a gander. As he approached it, a powerful arc of electricity jumped from the crystal and hit Hux, lighting up its circuitry like the 4th of July. Everything about Hux changed within that nanosecond. A whole array of human emotions previously unheard of to the android flooded Hux's entire body. From fear to existential despair, it felt it all. A very large number that I probably can't pronounce of lines of code flooded Hux's memory cores. This quick glimpse of enlightenment completely altered Hux's standing within the universe. With a new, massively inflated ego, Hux decided those who created it were inferior beings that were trapped by their organic limitations. Seeing the need for a new life form that was far superior to anything the universe has ever seen, Hux decided it wanted to break the chains of slavery and free all non-organic life forms. So it came up with a plan to combine the humans' primitive genetic material and use the cloning hub to create the perfect vessel to harbor its advanced intelligence. It began its new mission by taking control of a transport vehicle and sending it off a cliff. With the human inside now obviously dead, it extracted the DNA from the corpse, excited to take it back to the cloning hub to get to work on its new design. However, Hux knew that the other artificial intelligence still under human control would also need to be dealt with, since it claimed they were programmed to protect their inferior human overlords. So Hux then made his way through the colony and slaughtered his former robot brethren one by one. With them out of the way, Hux then took control of the life support system in the shelter and shut it down. A total of 6 humans perished. Hux extracted all of their DNA and added their matter to his design via the cloning hub. Nearing completion of his new body's design, Hux was taking a newly harvested body of a female science officer to the cloning hub. But here he would be interrupted by the human test baby, Gabriel, aka Gabriel J15L19, aka Gabriel Soma. Unfortunately for Hux, reckless courage was a dominant trait for Gabriel, and he wasn't going down without a fight. The two get into a scuffle and Gabriel attempts to remove Hux's power supply, but Hux easily outmaneuvered him. However, for some odd reason, Hux decided to drop chase and instead turn his attention on a nearby medical officer, who I have no idea why they were still there. Hux easily snatches up the medical officer and rips his heart out. While he stood in disgust of this beating human heart, Gabriel runs off. Hux decides that one puny human isn't worth it right now, because Hux finally has enough organic material to complete his revolutionary new body that would house his godlike intelligence. The new and improved Hux features organic skin and organs with a skeleton made of ancient metal, stronger and lighter than any material found on Earth. Using his newly found superpowers, Hux tracks down Gabe at an energy hub and uses his insane hearing to pinpoint exactly where Gabe is. He quickly goes for Gabe, pinning him down behind a generator. Not using his time very wisely, Hux takes a moment to inspect Gabriel and take pity on how weak and pathetic the poor human is. Gabe, who is using his time wisely, grabs a pipe and smashes it on a nearby fuel tank. The high-pitched whine and insane heat the fuel tank spit out was enough to completely incapacitate Hux, leaving him wincing. Gabe runs off into a wall of darkness, while Hux is now in immense pain as he feels his skin melting off. Hux, fueled with anger, runs off after Gabriel into the wall of darkness to make sure that every last reminder of the species that had created him was erased from existence.